We have been studying since the beginning of the year the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. And the Sermon on the Mount, in my view, is the place in the Bible where the revolutionary teachings of Jesus and the revolutionary way that Jesus teaches his followers to look at the world is taught most succinctly, or in its most compact form, where the largest part of it is compacted into a small space, more so than anywhere else, I think, in the New Testament. And so it's a very rich study. And now we are ready for chapter 7. We've gone all the way through Matthew chapter 5 and all the way through Matthew chapter 6. And now we are ready for Matthew chapter 7. And the beginning of Matthew chapter 7 is one of the passages of Scripture that I, quite frankly, do not enjoy preaching on, because it makes me feel like such a hypocrite. And so much of the Sermon on the Mount reminds me of where I fall short. And so many things in the Sermon on the Mount remind me of how I don't live up to the standards that Jesus teaches. But probably none more so than Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 6. And so let's look here and see at what he says here. And then we will break it down and look at it in some detail. Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. Do not judge, so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye and do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. I've seen several spiritual / scriptural / doctrinal controversies on Facebook lately, where people will put something on there, and some of them are intentionally designed to create controversy so that their post will just get hundreds of comments, and sure enough, in those comments they'll get hundreds and hundreds, but a lot of those comments are just people arguing back and forth, and pretty soon it devolves into calling people names. And I was reading through some of the comments on one of these posts recently, and the person who put the controversial comment on there about the third post comes back with, and don't say Matthew chapter 7 verse 1, do not judge, because that's not what that means. And most of the time when we talk about Matthew chapter 7, the first 5 verses, we talk about what it doesn't mean. We talk about areas and issues in which we are allowed to judge, in which we have to exercise judgment and discretion. And looking back at my own sermons, I reviewed some of my own sermons on this same passage of Scripture from the past, and that's exactly what I did. The first thing I would do, the first time I preached on this passage, was talk about what it doesn't mean. Now, it doesn't mean you can't do this, and it doesn't mean you can't do that. We're going to do that at the end today. I still have to do it because this passage is indeed one of the most misused passages in all of Scripture. But just because it's misused doesn't mean we shouldn't pay attention to what it does mean. We do need to think about what it doesn't mean when it's misused, but first we need to think about what it does mean and what Jesus does want us to understand. The word translated judge here, do not judge, comes from the Greek word krino. And it is a very broad word, just like our word for judge is. It can mean judgment of a court. It can mean judgment as far as deciding, picking between chocolate cake or chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream. It can mean, when I looked at at the Greek lexicon, it just went on and on and on with different definitions and different shades of meaning. But the one that applied specifically, the one that was used specifically in regard to Matthew chapter 7, is this. And it actually has a bunch of subparts, and I pulled these subparts. So this is not a direct linear quote. These are different quotes cobbled together, but they are quotes. Here's what the Greek lexicon says. To pass judgment upon the lives and actions of other people. Express an opinion about. Criticize. Find fault with. Condemn. Honestly, I want to sit down after I read that. Criticize. Find fault with. Condemn. I got no place talking about that. This is a real struggle. I'm really good at finding fault. I see it everywhere I look. Jesus says, do not judge so that you will not be judged. That's what he says. But I'm telling you, what he teaches in the life that he calls us to, it's not natural. It's not what just develops as our intellects and our views of the world develop. It's just not the natural course that most of us take. It's a choice that we have to make. Are we going to follow me, or are we going to follow him? Am I going to follow me? Are you going to follow you? Or are we going to follow him? And that's what he asks us over and over again. So what exactly, in what form does this talk about? Go with me to Romans chapter 14. Romans chapter 14, Paul uses a form of the same word, this krino, this judge word, and he applies it to a very specific situation. And he's writing to people in a Roman/Greek culture. He's writing to the city of Rome, so it's a Roman culture, but the Roman culture is extremely heavily influenced by Greek culture, including Greek worship practices and Greek pagan religious practices. And in this church in Rome, you have people who grew up in Judaism, who hated all things pagan, who hated all things having to do with meat sacrificed to idols and anything else that went on in a pagan temple. And then in the same church, you have people who grew up in pagan worship, eating meat sacrificed and burned on the altar of an idol as part of worship. Having meals with this food cooked on these idols and having this meal as a form of worship. And that's what Paul is talking about. There's this clash over what are we going to do about eating together and the kind of food we eat and the place that it's cooked and where it comes from. And here's what the Holy Spirit inspires the Apostle Paul to write in Romans chapter 14, verse 3. The one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat. And the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him. Paul says some of you have different attitudes. Some of you think, well, an idol doesn't exist. It's no such thing as an idol. And that's just what Paul says elsewhere. He says, so you can eat a food cooked on an altar to an idol and it not bother you a bit. Others of you think, well, that is associated with an idol and it's defiled, and I was taught that everything having to do with an idol is defiled, and if I eat that, I'm eating defilement to myself. He says, well, that's fine, don't eat it. Then other people think, I grew up eating food like that, and every time I did, I thought I was worshiping an idol. I thought I was worshiping a God that doesn't really exist. But if I eat it now, I'll feel like I'm worshiping that God all over again. Paul says, don't eat it. But don't look at the person who can eat it and condemn that person. And you person who can eat it, don't look at the person who can't eat it and condemn that person. And then he explains the reasoning in verse 4. Who are you to judge? Krino. Who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls, and he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. And then he applies it to a different thing in verse 5. He says, one person regards one day above another, another regards every day alike. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it for the Lord, and he who eats does so for the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. And he who eats not for the Lord he does not eat, and gives thanks to God. A couple of weeks ago, we had what our world calls Easter Sunday. Now, I did not preach on the resurrection of Jesus on Easter Sunday, and I pretty much never do, because I grew up being taught that Easter Sunday and the use of Easter Sunday as some sort of religious thing is not what the Bible teaches and is not what we should do. And so I still carry that attitude. And if I preached on the resurrection on Easter Sunday, it would bother my conscience. It would make me feel like I was doing something wrong. But I have a lot of friends, a lot of other preachers who do preach on the resurrection on Easter Sunday. Some people posted things on social media about the resurrection of Christ on Easter. I heard about a particular controversy within a family where one person posted something on social media and another family member criticized them. And basically, well, I don't want to overstate it, but they criticized them really strongly. Look at what it says in Romans 14, verse 5. Verse 6. He who observes the day observes it for the Lord, and he who eats does so for the Lord. A Gentile can't tell a Jew, don't observe the Passover. A Christian can't tell a Jew, don't observe Pentecost. A Jew can't tell a Gentile, don't observe your holiday. Don't think that it's special. And so you can't tell me not to treat the 4th of July as important, because I think it is important. Or not to treat Thanksgiving as important, because I think it is important. And I give thanks to God on Thanksgiving, but it's not in the Bible. You see, telling the other person that they're wrong and you're right because your attitude says you're right is you standing in the place of God. It's you saying, I'm going to decide whether you are righteous or wicked. And I'm going to pass judgment on you, and I'm going to inflict punishment on you. I'm going to be in charge of justice. And that's the problem. You come down to verse 10, Romans 14. But you, why do you judge your brother? Or you again, why do you regard your brother with contempt? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. You see, you're going to stand before God just like this other person is. And they're not going to be answering to you, and you're not going to be answering to them when the two of you stand there. You come down to verse 13. Therefore, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather determine this, not to put an obstacle or a stumbling block in a brother's way. Not to put an obstacle or a stumbling block. When we see what we perceive as a shortcoming, as a mistake, as a failure on the part of another, our motive must be not to hurt the other person. Our role is not to exact justice. Our role is not to enforce rules. Our role is to encourage and uplift. Sometimes encouraging and uplifting includes talking to a person about a sin or about a mistake. But it must never be to put a stumbling block, to tear down, to injure, to push from Christ. Never, ever, ever. But most of the time, our criticisms have precious little to do with spiritual things. Most of the time, our criticisms are much less important. Have you ever heard somebody criticized because they didn't wear a tie? because they didn't wear a tie to serve at the Lord's table. I've heard it. You think about people's skin color. You think about people's ethnic background. And you make this sweeping, broad generalization. Well, you know he would just do this, or you know he's going to think that because he is from this place or he is a part of that group. Remember what Jesus says? Do not judge. Do not pass judgment upon. Do not criticize, find fault with. I heard a literal judge, a human, a Tennessee Circuit Court judge. He was retired at the time, but I was a really young lawyer, and this man went on for about 5 or 10 minutes at how he detested people who eat corn. Corn. It's been 20 years ago. It's been 22 years ago, and I still can't believe that somebody could hold an attitude like that. But it's similar to wearing a tie. Quite frankly, it's not a lot dissimilar from the King James Version. I've heard people give round criticism about which translation into English that you use. Well, should I use one from 1600, or should I use one from 1800, or should I use one from the 1900s? Well, go ask Jesus. Most people can't use the one that Jesus used, but Jesus used a translation from about 100 years before he was born. So be careful about what kind of judgment you pass upon people. I heard about a preacher one time who was criticized because he grinned a lot. Because he grinned. They just thought it was a stupid look on his face, and so they told him, I just think that grin you wear around is a stupid look. That's what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is talking about this finding fault, this criticism, this tearing everything down, this looking at the world like it's supposed to conform to your idea of what's right and what's wrong. Putting yourself in the judgment seat and saying, I'm the one who decides. That's what he's talking about. James chapter 4, verse 12. There is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? Are you able to save? Can you forgive sins? Can you condemn people to hell? Well, keep that in mind when you have a problem with another person. Because there is a lawgiver who can do those things, but you're not him. You go back here to Matthew chapter 6. Jesus gives us some more insight in verse 2. He says, for in the way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Jesus says we often have an erroneous view of other people. And you have one standard for yourself, and you have another standard for other people. And you say, well, I was tired. Well, I was really pressed for time. You don't know what a hard week I've had. But then you say to the other person, and you say, well, why doesn't he pick out the songs that I like? Or why doesn't he dress the way I think he should dress? Or why doesn't she wear her hair the way I think she should wear her hair? Or why doesn't she wear a different color? You have all these excuses for yourself, but you have no space for another person. Jesus says, is that how you want God to treat you? Is that the standard that you want God to use for you? Do you want God to criticize the choice of shirt that you wear? Do you want Him to be worried about the color coordination of your clothing? Is that how you want it to be when you get to the judgment seat of Christ? Jesus says that's what you're going to get if that's what you're giving. If that's how you're looking at other people, that's how God is going to look at you. Do you want Him to criticize the way you pronounce baptize? Is it baptize or baptize? I've heard it criticized. Jesus says, be careful what standard you use. Be careful how you expect other people to conform to your opinions. Because God's going to use that for you. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 5. Therefore, do not go on passing judgment before the time, but wait until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the things hidden in the darkness and disclose the motives of men's hearts, that each man's praise will come to him from God. One of the big mistakes that people make is they pretend they know other people's motives. They pretend that they know why a person does this or why a person acts like that. They pretend to know what's in their heart. God says, I'm the one who knows people's hearts. I will reveal what's in people's hearts. And until I do, you won't know. And so you can look at certain things on the outside. You can certainly know the difference between right and wrong. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But knowing a person's motives, knowing a person's heart, that's reserved for God alone. Reserved for God. But he's looking at hypocrisy. If you come down here to verse 3 of Matthew chapter 6, verses 3, 4, and 5. He says, why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. I don't know if you've worked with logs very much, or if you worked with posts or anything of that nature, but I'll tell you a secret about wood and about trees once you cut them down. There's a lot of little things that come off of trees. And so you have a log and maybe it's this big around or maybe it's this big around or anywhere in between. But a log is something that's long enough to cover a span and provide weight, provide strength and weight. And so it's got to have a certain diameter. It's got to have a certain size. And then in that log, on the bark that's on the outside, or you take all the bark off, there's going to be dust. There's going to be little flecks of all kinds of different things that'll come off of that. And so when you're working with a log, there'll be a lot of dust and things will get into your eye. But Jesus, what he's using here is he's using a picture that is absurd. He's using an absurdity to illustrate the absurdity of our believing we're in a position to pass judgment on other people. He says, you're worried about a little fleck of dust in somebody else's eye when you have an entire tree coming out of your own eye. You can't even lift your head because you've got this log sticking out of your eye, but you're going over to the other person and saying, here, let me get that dust out of your eye. It's absurd. It's crazy. You're going to do a lot more damage. You're going to hurt the people you're trying to help because you're not addressing your own problem. You're not addressing what's really going on with you. The people that Jesus dealt with loved to find fault. They loved to find a person and point out what was wrong with them, but not to help that person, only to lift themselves up. I saw this happen personally on a Wednesday night one time, where it wasn't me, but another preacher got up and he delivered an invitation, and he did not use the word baptism. He talked about obeying the gospel. He talked about coming to Christ. He was talking to a group of people who had heard him talk about baptism many times. And after it was over, a young man with a lot of problems and a lot of difficulties and a lot of issues came up to him and excoriated him for not using the word baptism in his invitation. And this young man, his faults were obvious. If you met him, if you meet him one time, it will not take you long to figure out this person's got issues. And everybody has issues, but this person's issues hit you pretty quick when you first talk to him, whether you know him well or whether you don't know him well. I've seen similar things happen to other people, but that's what Jesus is talking about. You think you're in a position to criticize, to change other people, to require other people to conform to your ideas, but your problems are so much bigger than theirs. Your faults and your shortcomings are so much bigger than theirs, and you're just whacking people in the head and knocking people down and doing more damage under the guise of trying to help people. And that's what he's talking about. Luke chapter 6, verse 36. Jesus says, "Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. And do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Pardon, and you will be pardoned." The base outlook for a follower of Jesus, the fundamental way that Christians are supposed to look at the world, is with mercy. Our personalities, our interactions with other people should be characterized with grace, mercy, forgiveness, latitude, understanding. If you, to use a modern computer analogy, that's our default setting. Our default setting, when you run into us, when something happens to us, we respond with mercy. That's what he says. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. And then the next word, do not judge. Pardon, and you will be pardoned. That's our base. That's the first thing that should characterize how we deal with other people. And so when we do criticize, we need to consider three things. Number one, are we motivated by a desire to get rid of something we don't like? Are we trying to correct something that is affecting us in a bad way? I just don't like it, and if you would change it, I would be happier. That's a focus on self. It's about me. It's about getting what I want. The opposite of that is, am I trying to help you? Do I think by changing this, you would be better? Do I think that if I told you this, it would do good for you? Not make you mad at me, not let you see that what you're doing is hurting people, but make you a better person. Are you motivated by helping another person? Number two, are you facing the subject with honesty and gentleness? Are you being honest with yourself? Are you being honest with why you feel like you feel? Or are you just trying to get your way? And then are you being gentle? Are you treating the other person with respect and concern for them, and not just concern for yourself? And number three, do you find it disagreeable, or do you find it pleasurable? Anytime we criticize another person, it should be with personal displeasure. It should be something that we don't like to do. If we're enjoying telling that person what's wrong, we're not in the right frame of mind. If we think that this is a good thing, that this is going to make the world better, and we're not taking a risk with a person's mindset and a person's emotions and a person's souls, we're not doing it. We're not doing it in the way that Jesus wants us to do it, with mercy. Finally, Matthew chapter 7, verse 6. Jesus totally throws out the possible interpretation that a lot of people impose on this passage, which is, you can't ever tell anybody that anything is wrong. A lot of people use verse 1, do not judge lest you be judged. They use that to say, don't judge me. Don't you tell me my behavior is wrong. Don't you tell me that my sin is not righteous. Verse 6, Jesus says, do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, for they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Well, let me ask you something. How do you know who the dogs are? How do you know who the swine are? If you go back up to verse 2, verse 1 he says, do not judge so that you will not be judged. Verse 2 he says, with what judgment you use, what standard of judgment, what standard of measure you use, it will be measured back to you. So in verse 1 he says, do not judge, but in verse 2 he says, you're going to use some standard of judgment. And in verse 6 he says, beware of the dogs and the swine. Beware of those who are going to bring evil and don't share your holiness and your righteousness with people who are only going to defile it. You understand that requires some serious judgment, right? And so you have to read that verse back up into verse 1. Verse 1 doesn't mean nothing is wrong, and Christians never get to say that something is sinful or that something is wrong. That's absolutely not what it means. Christians are still supposed to be about holiness, about righteousness, about commitment to good. But we care about how our expression of those things affects other people. And we never want our personalities to become about judgment and criticism and finding fault. We want our interactions to be about mercy, but we want our lives to be about holiness, about purity. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Right? If you go down to verse 15, he says, beware of false prophets. How do you know who the false prophets are? Verse 20, he says, you'll know them by their fruits. What does that mean? You have to judge their fruits. You have to look at what they produce. You have to look at the effect of what they teach. Verse 1, now we're talking about what it does not mean. Verse 1 does not mean that you don't pay attention to the difference between right and wrong. It doesn't mean that you don't express the difference between right and wrong. It means that you express it with mercy and with kindness, but you remain committed to holiness. John chapter 7, verse 24, Jesus says, do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. We must be able to tell the difference between good and evil, and we must avoid evil, not to condemn people, but to keep ourselves and the kingdom of Christ pure. And so verse 1 is mostly about personal opinion. Verse 1 is mostly about personal preference, taste, what you like, what you don't like. If what you like and what you prefer gets elevated to the point that it characterizes most of the way you look at the world, it characterizes most of what you say to people or about people, you're way out of balance. You're way out of balance. There is an extreme importance to keeping away from dogs and swine. People who symbolize danger and impurity and defilement in the world. But maintaining our commitment to mercy, maintaining compassion and concern for other people is extremely important. And that's what Jesus is talking to us about. Don't be critical people. Don't be the kind of people who find fault everywhere you go, but be careful about defilement. And don't cast your pearls before swine. Don't take the spiritual blessings that you have and let them mix with those that would defile them. That requires some judgment. It requires some discretion. But it does not require a critical spirit. For those of you who are worried about the condition of your soul, if you're worried about whether or not your sins are forgiven, if you're worried about whether or not you will spend eternity in heaven, we want you to know that we are here to assist you with that. Any question we can answer, any study that we can engage in, any service we can provide, whether you're ready to come to Christ for the first time because you understand how a person becomes a Christian, or if you're ready to study how to become a Christian, or if you are already a Christian but you need help in addressing a spiritual situation, we're here to help. Whatever your need, just let us know in whatever method you choose. And we'll do everything we can and take whatever risk necessary to help you. God bless you.